Greetings, everybody. Welcome to All Type Streams. What's this? The fourth episode. And today, once again, have on my reliable co-host, Sean Last. Sean Last, say hello.
Hello.
Hello. So today, we're going to talk about a bunch of stuff. We're going to talk about the Peterson. We're going to talk about the Cofnas response to Kevin McDonald after 20 years of silence. A real academic finally responded to Kevin McDonald on his JQ stuff. And we're not experts. We're just going to sort of give our little opinions about this back and forth between Cofnas and McDonald, or more so Sean is than me. We're going to talk about the Jordan Peterson. And basically, I've been watching a whole bunch of Jordan Peterson stuff. I plan on making a video response to Jordan Peterson. And I'm noticing a lot of pretty substantial holes in stuff that Jordan Peterson is talking about. The Sandre guy, he made a video response to you or to an article you wrote.
Yeah, he made a video response to an article on the alternative hypothesis about lead and IQ. It was really bad.
Yeah, it was really really postmodern, as Peterson would say. But before getting into that, one thing I want to talk about is that on the alternative hypothesis, basically the website, like when Sean and I set out to make the alternativehypothesis.org website, we had a pretty clear idea of what we wanted to do. We wanted a place to basically put like sort of like all the basic arguments on hereditarianism, and to some degree arguments against diversity, and some historical stuff that I wanted to talk about, like slavery and segregation, and particular things like South Africa and the so-called supposed Belgian Congo genocide. So we had like a very clear thing we were doing with that website. And so when we did it, we basically did it. And then we got to a point where we were kind of done. And then I started making YouTube videos, and there was no real point for the website. So what I want to do is open up the alternativehypothesis.org as a platform. Now, what I've done is that there's a link in the description where people can go there and they can submit articles that they want to write that can be put on the site. And there's an email, and it's sent to 4 people who have agreed to be editors, 4 people whose discretion are I can sort of trust. And my reasoning behind this is because I saw there was a guy, and if this guy is watching, please submit your article. He wrote something that I thought was very interesting about distinguishing Chinese from Western psychology. And it was this real deep dive, and it was a lot of effort. But the thing is, it was on his personal blog that nobody ever saw. And so what I'm thinking is that, A, there's a lot of stuff that people write that does not see the light of day simply because, they haven't spent years on the internet building up a platform, or they just didn't get lucky. In a sense, I kind of got lucky. Well, maybe we don't talk about that, but for whatever reason, I have a platform, they don't. So, but they have good content, they have good ideas. And another thing is that I think a lot of people would be more likely to do stuff if they know they're going to get an audience. So that's sort of why I wanted to open up the alternativehypothesis.org as a platform. So I'll have a link to a page that has the email that you send it to, and sort of the guidelines for the articles. And it'll be sent to the editors, and they'll decide. And I'm one of them. We'll decide what gets posted and whatever. So this is actually something that the rightstuff.biz used to do. I don't know if they still do it. Sean, do they still have articles at the Right Stuff? Do you know?
I'm not exactly sure. It used to be a much bigger focus, at least, at the very least we can say. I don't think they have a running blog at the moment, but I might be wrong.
Yeah. Well, if they did, the fact that we're asking whether or not they have a running blog is, I think, pretty much evidence that if they do, it's kind of like marginal at this point. But that was one good thing that they did, because they gave a lot of ideas a platform. Now, unfortunately, our editorial discretions may differ from what the Right Stuff put on their site. We'll just say that. So we're gonna start to do that, and that'll be good. And another thing is that I think a lot of people who would like to do a deep dive and stuff, they'd be like, well, what's the point of doing it if no one's going to see it? right? So I think it may actually stimulate, if it causes one or two people to do something that they wouldn't otherwise do, then that'll be great. Now, maybe we'll get articles coming in, maybe we'll get no articles coming in. Who knows? So, maybe I'll make this announcement and it won't go anywhere. So anyway, so what do you want to talk about first? Do you want to talk about the Peterson, the Cofnas, or well, let's look at the audience. What does the audience want us to talk about?
I mean, you said Peterson first, so we could just do Peterson on the grounds that was the first name you said.
All right, so I'll talk about the Peterson first. So I was watching like a lot of videos from Jordan Peterson, and he had one video that particularly stuck out to me, which he was talking about Marxism. He was talking about postmodernism, and he was talking about white privilege. Now, one thing that's interesting is that he like we actually looked at this, because one thing he does throughout all of his talks is he talks about identity politics as being this sort of outgrowth between Marxism and postmodernism. And it's this very sort of like circumstantial explanation that this comes from that, or like this is the Marxist frame, and this frame is then applied onto other groups. Like the Marxists talked about the working class and the working class oppression, and then Peterson's, this is kind of a gross oversimplification of Peterson, is that the Marxists then became postmodernists, and the postmodernists took the economic oppression, just said, oh, well, there's all these other forms of oppression. Women are oppressed, brown people are oppressed. And the thing about that may be sort of true, but like I look at that as kind of true, but who cares? Sean, do you disagree with me on that? Or
I mean, that'd be a weird thing to disagree with, like whether or not you care or not. It's just
not whether I care, but whether or not it's even important. Because one thing that Peterson talks about, and we were sort of Sean and I were talking about this before, is does Peterson recognize the innateness of tribalism? And he does, right? We've seen like tweets of him, and I haven't. The thing is, that's not really something that you could expect him to cover in a video on the innateness of tribalism, but he seems to mock it, right? He seems to mock it as like stupid chimpanzee thinking, right? But that sort of calls into question, if this tribalism is in fact stupid chimpanzee thinking, then what's the point of like the postmodernist thing? My point of view is that Jordan Peterson's all this talk about this Marxists and postmodernists is actually it's kind of a blind alley, in a sense that basically the fact that there's this historical connection to Marxism is just a matter of circumstance. It's just because, Marxism was a thing that happened at one point in history, and he's trying to make out, the Black oppression narrative as something inherently Marxist. One thing I would point out is that you had people, and then this is a bit difficult because there actually was slavery at the time. But the thing is, you had racial oppression narratives like well before Marxism. And so I don't really think that Marxism, or what he calls postmodernism, have a whole lot to do with any of this stuff. That this is just the natural nationalism of all these other groups, and that I think Peterson is trying to say that it's not a natural thing, that it's something that is constructed, something that is a result of political movements in order to make individualism possible. Because if this is just a natural thing, if this is just some innate characteristic of the human condition, then that makes individualism more difficult. John, do you disagree with this, or what do you think?
Well, I mean, I think that, yeah, I mean, I think Marxism and postmodernism is just a particular manifestation of, I think Peterson would agree with this, some deep evolutionary instinct that people have. I think his project, or what he's trying to do, is to say that yes, people are naturally inclined towards this sort of tribalism, but that you can, through some sort of psychological process of adjustment and therapy and this sort of thing, you can become a lot less reliant on tribalism than people are sort of naturally predisposed to be, and that this is a very important political objective for people in order to avoid like very ugly group conflict.
Yeah, but then Well, so you would say that
And,
Peterson is like aware. Go ahead. Were you saying something?
oh, I was just gonna say that in a way, like on paper, I think that's a very nice thing to say too. But it's similar to most sort of philosophical projects to try to make people less collectivist. And there are a fair number of bad things about tribalism, but and I don't know, I haven't seen a survey of a Peterson's audience, but if I had to guess, I would say they're disproportionately white. And it's the same thing we've seen a million times before, whereby white people become convinced to be less tribal while no one else is being convinced to be less tribal. And the net result of that is an ugly thing for white people.
Right. The net effect is get fucked. Uh, yeah, the great Molyneux had a great analogy talking about that. He was talking about it's like you have two teams playing a soccer game, and one of the teams refuses to conceive of itself as a team, start to deconstruct the idea of a team, deconstruct the idea of the competition, and I think that's a sort of good analogy of what he's talking about. But another thing that's sort of maddening about Jordan Peterson is that he seems to recognize innate tribalism, and I sort of infer this from his responses to other people in sort of the Q&A section and from what he says in the Q&A sections of his videos and what he says on Twitter. He doesn't really address it in his own speeches. He doesn't talk about the innateness of tribalism in his own speeches that I have seen. Maybe there's one that he has. I'm just going sort of based on about 12, 13 hours of listening to Jordan Peterson. But one thing he does talk about, he talks about family prejudice as something innate and immutable. And that's something very interesting. He talks about this prejudice towards the family, or bias towards your offspring, and bias towards your genetic relations, as something that's inherent and immutable. But then he acts as if, as if sort of a prejudice or bias towards a more broader and shallower genetic similarity of race, or below that some sort of narrow ethnic identity, that's somehow to be overcome, or the cause of some sort of evil or something like that.
Or at least a certain degree of that tribalism, because he's talked before about how there's a healthy level of, like, so collectivism and feeling like you're part of a group is an important part of sort of a healthy psychological process, but that it has to, you can overdo it in a way that's very bad, and that you sort of have to, the way he words it is kind of weird, but that somehow your group identity is supposed to contribute to you becoming individuated away from the rest of the group, which I'm not sure exactly what that's supposed to mean, but that's what he says.
Right. Well, I'll have to look into that and excite, because I hadn't seen that bit. So, but if that's the thing, if he's basically saying, sure, group identity, but in moderation, well, what? But then that sort of begs the question: what is moderation? Right? What is the moderate amount of group identity? Like mine is, oh, you have a country. Basically, you have racially sealed countries, and you can allow some immigrants and trade. That's sort of my view of like what is the moderate amount. And now Peterson would disagree. So the thing is, if he says don't overdo it, well, what's overdoing it?
Yeah, I mean, if we want to talk about, I guess, just the political validity of this, it's the whole thing of, you might not care about race, but like other people care about your race, right? Exactly. So, I mean, I don't really think you even have to personally care about being white at all to see the problem is there are other people that recognize you as white, and they do care about you being white, and they want to curtail your speech and take your resources from you on the grounds that you're white.
Yeah.
Right. So you probably don't want to be around those people.
Yeah, it's sort of like our great friend Matt Heimbach, who's a great fan of his in-laws. But he actually had a great line where he said, "You may not care about race, but race cares about you." I thought that was a very good line. He may have gotten that from someone else, I don't know, but I heard it from Matt Heimbach. So now another thing that I found sort of interesting is that Peterson, he talks about how society, quote unquote, society essentially functions. Okay, let me say this. At one point, he talks about chimpanzees, right? And he talks about how chimpanzees, sort of within the group, they're not tyrannical. That tyrannical chimpanzee leaders are unstable, and they basically get killed quickly. But that the most effective tribe or group leaders or clan leaders or pack leaders of chimpanzees tend to be those that everyone likes. They're powerful themselves, but they're also well liked and they have a lot of allies within, the clan. But when chimpanzees get into contact with other chimpanzees, it's like immediate total war and to the death. So so he talks about that, but then he goes on to talk about a functional society. He talks about how the Western world is a functional society, and he talks about like firms and hierarchies and how and he says some things that I think are particularly questionable when he talks about, for example, social media. He talks about how Bill Gates provided a great thing he provided great value to the world. Yes, he got compensated, but the value that he provided well outstrips what he was compensated. And I think that's a bit questionable. We can go into that in certain terms of like what is a natural monopoly. Sort of like there would have been a Bill Gates no matter what, and Bill Gates basically just filled a slot. He didn't really, there was going to be someone who's going to fill that slot no matter what. But I don't want to go down into that. But he's talking about, and I guess what I'm trying to say is that the United States today could be seen as like not necessarily a coherent society. That all of Peterson's description of the West only makes sense insofar as the West is a single society. Now, one thing, I'm sort of going off a field and I'm talking about stuff that may not make a lot of sense if people haven't listened to Jordan Peterson. But when he talks about the West, he's talking about a singular society, or at least the United States as if it's a singular society, which I don't think is necessarily true today, and I think it's becoming increasingly less true. So when he talks about how things are functional if you have a society with these values, well, okay, and he sort of analogizes that to a chimpanzee tribe that's functional within the tribe. Okay, but what about conflict within the other tribes? He himself talks about how savage and unfair, the chimpanzee tribes are with each other. And so when we're talking about, the Western societies have these values, what happens when a Western society starts to classify certain people as outgroups? So I don't know if you have anything to say on that.
I guess one thing to say about the tribalism thing that maybe I should have said before was that in one of his books, he talks about he describes his own intellectual development as, I guess he was bothered to like an extreme degree by the sort of the Cold War, the things that the communists did, the things that the Nazis did, etc., and this sort of thing. And he sees that people sort of naturally form into tribes and they naturally get very ideological, and this leads to this conflict. And he says that sort of the 20th century demonstrated that our weapon technology had progressed to a point where allowing us to do this thing that we very naturally are inclined to do is going to lead to increasingly catastrophic results. And then on that basis, we need to try very hard as a society to do this very unnatural, and very difficult thing. Because it should be noted that at least in his books, he does call this like an extremely difficult, unlikely. He sort of recognizes the degree of difficulty in what he is calling on people to do. But like they said, the reason why he wants that to happen is because he's afraid of the sort of what group conflict could look like in the 21st century, just given technology.
Right. Well, I look at, okay, so I think you obviously know what my response would be to that. And I think you have the same response to that, is that he's talking about an impossible program versus a program of separation. Like even we're talking about like the Soviet Union versus the United States, like you could say those were two groups that identified themselves as separate groups. Now, how different were they really? That's something that, from my point of view, they weren't really all that different in terms of like the people in those places, in terms of like a uniform white race, a uniform European race, even though, Russians, Slavic people versus, Anglo-descended people, there's going to be differences there genetically speaking, and more so culturally speaking. But even those differences, I think, are not not enough to be an inherent source of conflict. So but the thing is, they perceived themselves as two separate groups, but there was no conflict that happened between them so long as they were separate states, you know. And I think increasingly, you look at the world today, it's like people just like the idea of wars between two separate states is becoming increasingly unpalatable, certainly in the European world. But it's also something that just if the world, as the world becomes more democratic and as information becomes harder to suppress, becomes more and more difficult to do. So we're seeing, I think we're seeing a situation where wars between states are becoming increasingly difficult to gin up. And now you can talk about wars between states that don't really matter. Like you could talk about, oh, there's this ongoing conflict between Sudan and South Sudan. Yeah, who cares? I'm talking about like real countries with like real ability to fuck up the world. And Jordan Peterson, I think, is referring to a problem that is increasingly ceasing to exist. That is wars between states, and increasingly, the issue is coming to be a war within states. What do you? I don't know. Do you think I'm?
I mean, certainly that seems to be the case with respect to the United States, and I mean, intuitively that seems to be the case around the world. You hear an awful lot about conflict within states these days.
Right.
I think that Peterson's whole project, in terms of this, and Peterson, to be fair, like this is not the only thing Peterson talks about. In fact, it's probably not even the main thing he talks about. But
primarily,
but in terms of
not
this
primarily
thing,
about, yeah.
I would say that if you want to try to do this sort of project of getting everyone in a healthy psychological relationship with their sense of tribalism in a way that isn't going to lead to a lot of group conflict, then like that's a fine thing in a way to do, but you should start with black people. Let's put it that way. And then you should start with the people who already, because starting with white people is a very bad idea, because white people already have much lower levels of tribalism. The lower they go, the more vulnerable they are to these other groups. You should start with these other groups. And once you get them down to, and it would be a very interesting and in many ways very cool thing if someone successfully got African Americans and Asian Americans and all these groups to have as low of a level of ethnic tribalism as do white Americans. And then we could talk about lowering everyone's level. But right. It's a politically dangerous thing to just hammer away at the white sense of tribalism while not doing much with anyone else.
Because and frankly, that's what Peterson's doing. Like, even if Peterson says, "Oh, I support lowering everyone's tribalism," well, meanwhile, he goes out and speaks in front of like all white audiences. So it's pretty. It seems kind of. It seems like Jordan Peterson is fighting. Like, the thing is, he has a lot of philosophy, but at the end of the day, Jordan Peterson is just individualist, and he's making all the same errors that the old individualists did, which is, we're getting white people to be less tribal, which is all they've succeeded at doing. And they may think, oh, well, I don't think in terms of race. Well, again, it's, you may not care about race, but race cares about you. And so if there's only one group that you're convincing to be less tribal, and they're opening their borders and getting wrecked as a result, then all that's going to happen is, and the great irony is that the result is that they're destroying the individualistic group, by forcing them by saying, hey, be more individualistic. And another thing I'll say, and this is a statement that's a bit more controversial. Jordan Peterson is obviously against open borders, but I would say that individualistic thinking is what has led to open borders. I don't know, Sean, what do you think? Do you disagree or?
Okay, well, two things. Firstly, just to finish the tribalism thing, I think that it would be a place for someone. I think that it's somewhat a shame, because there would be a place for someone like Peterson to try to get white people to accept a healthy level of tribalism without going too far, but recognizing that currently white people not only don't have a healthy level of tribalism, they have like an anti-tribalism, which we discussed before in various mediums. But that it is true that tribalism is a dangerous thing, that you can go way too far if they can make you a seething, hate-filled person, and that's a very ugly thing. But it doesn't. It'd be more useful, I think, someone actually aiming at promoting an actual healthy level of tribalism among white people. But in terms of the individualism thing, I mean, intuitively, that doesn't my intuitive reaction is that sounds like it's not true, but I don't know your reasoning behind that. So,
well, my reasoning behind that would be that, well, first off, the countries that have, well, the countries that are engaging in mass replacement level migration into themselves are the most individualistic countries, is these Western European countries, right? You could say that, well, here, let me point to these African countries that literally have no border controls. It's like, well, okay, but nobody cares, right? It's like, hey, Angola has no border controls, and yet they get no immigrants. So I mean, you could say stuff like that. So I would say empirically, it just sort of goes together that that more individualistic countries are in fact engaging in this suicidal immigration stuff. But I guess sort of the narrative that I have in my head about this is that if you're an individualist, it's not that you're necessarily going to be for mass immigration or open borders. It's not that individualists are going to be for open borders. It's going to be that they don't rate it at the top of the stack. And so you could have, and so as a result, you could end up getting open borders legislation slipped in there. For example, like with Donald Trump, you have a lot of Trump voters and they're asking Trump for a lot of stuff, and Trump can only do so many things. Oh, I want a tariff. Oh, I want gun rights. Oh, I want a tax break. Oh, I want the borders closed. Borders closed is just one of those things. Whereas if the Trump supporters were all like more collectivist, more racially collectivist, that immigration stuff would be at the top of the stack and it would be the most likely to get done. So it's not so much that that the individualism causes these people to become, open borders ideologues, but that although that does happen to a minor degree, right? I think we remember the ANCAP days where there are people like that, but it's more insidious than that. It is that it weakens the primal or existential priority of keep England white. I mean, do you see what I'm saying? And does that?
Well, I think that maybe individualism can lead to people being more friendly towards open borders, but only in the presence of like false egalitarian narratives, right? Because I think that from an individualist standpoint, the actual facts about groups and about politics justifies the sort of views that we have on immigration.
Right. But see, I would just say in practice, that's like that's kind of big brained, right? I think that in practice, like ooga booga, keep out the darkies is something that's more politically actionable because it's easier to understand and do and more natural, as opposed to let me show you a bunch of charts as to why you don't want immigrants from most of the world, right? I think that's a bit too. I think that's a bit. I think that that's something that's not so politically actionable, but
to a degree, I mean, in the United States, I think it's pretty easy because all you have to say is, well, as it turns out, these non-white people blame us for a bunch of problems, and they want to take our resources and stop us from being able to say what we want and then infringe on our basic political rights.
Yeah. And it's getting easier to make that case in the United States because the hour's getting later and later and later. It's becoming impossible to deny at this point because they're just so in your face with their shit. But it's not. But again, it wasn't that I wasn't saying that.
Well,
I wasn't saying that individuals become friendly to open borders. I was saying that they prioritize it less. And as a result, some activists can sort of slip it in, and it's not going to be the first priority thing to overturn, right? They're going to be more the first priority thing to overturn would be tax cuts, right? That's one.
Yeah, to some degree. Although, as we discussed before, if the individuals, people, say in the mid-20th century, were actually successful at stopping the welfare state from growing, immigration probably would have been significantly curtailed in the U.S. relative to what it ended up being.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I guess it's worth saying that the egalitarian ideology, in a sense, is like very anti-individualist, right? Insofar as individualism has anything to do with actually judging people on their individual characteristics.
Right.
The sort of egalitarian ideology is very anti that.
Right. But right. And yeah, I get what you're saying. And so is this egalitarian ideology that has been a chief culprit in pushing and being for open borders. But
now that ideology didn't take root as much in the eastern section of Europe. But is that because they weren't individualistic, or is that because they had like a fairly totalitarian regime imposing a different narrative at the time? That's sort of to some degree the answer is probably both.
Right. My knee-jerk reaction would be the totalitarian regime. Also, another thing is if you have a bunch of people that are highly collectivistic, that an egalitarian narrative may not matter. Right? They may say, "Oh, we're equal. Okay, I don't care. You're still not Polish." Right? It
right,
could be something like that. It's like, oh, blacks are just as genetically smart as me. Well, good for them. I still don't want them here. So that could, you can have a narrative like that. And the thing is, like the racial differences narrative really, in a sense, it's complicated, because one thing I know is that when you talk about just the description of genetic racial differences between racial groups, that causes white people sort of down the path to sort of racial identity and thinking in terms of their group as a group and starting to get out of the individualist the individualist mind frame. But I forgot where I was going with this. But I don't think it necessarily matters. So it's important to talk about race differences, but that's something that you really do. That's something that you really do to individualists and to egalitarians, although less success with that, is you point out, look, there are these practical differences that make your individualist program or perhaps an egalitarian program impossible. So it works with them, and then it eventually leads to racial nationalism. But if you could just jump straight to racial nationalism just because you have, a base gut level collectivism that isn't stamped down, then this talk about accepting race differences doesn't really matter. In other words, the egalitarian narrative doesn't really matter if they're just inherently tribal. Well, let me ask you this: all the tribalist blacks in Africa, I'll bet you they accept an egalitarian narrative. So.
I mean, I don't know. We'd have to. I would not be surprised if they had mythologies about like the tribe over there. They're like dumb and slow or something like that.
Yeah, that's true. They probably have. They probably have stories about how their tribe is the best tribe, whatever, and that they really deserve to own everything, but some event caused them to be cast down or whatever. Yeah,
it's a hard thing to balance because, I mean, on the one hand, in this instance at least, there would be some utility in just very brute, disgust-based, like big group identity, collectivistic sort of action. But in general, that sort of cultural pattern is not good for society. And so, and part of what makes like Western Europe the best Europe historically is the fact that it broke away from the sorts of social norms to a degree that the rest of Europe did not.
Right. And those social norms are now killing us. So, I guess, but I think so. But I think you can still have that in regards to like, and the thing is, we had it. Like, it's like this isn't theoretical. Like, we had that kind of brute level social disgust regarding other races, right? It's just that the narrower particular sort of ethnic exclusion that sort of faded away. Right, and we're talking in the United States.
To some degree. I mean, I think we probably have a lot less than we used to.
Sure. Well, you just went. Well, I'm not going to say, but well, I think in the United States, like that's definitely not the case. I mean, there may be some places like New York City where those things are preserved, and I think preserved in an artificial environment. But again, the United States, you see those ethnic differences. Just they don't matter now. Genetic differences, as you talked about, like, for example, certain ethnic groups like actually vote Democrat in the United States today, even though nobody really sort of perceives European sub-ethnic groups anymore within the United States. So, but I think like that sort of gut level, that sort of gut tribalism among whites in terms of whites as a single group and other races as outgroups, that seems to have existed in the United States. That seems to have been a place where the United States got to at one point. And I think whites in the U.S. are still like that. It's just a heavily suppressed gut reaction that there is sort of a pan-European nationalism in the United States. And so I guess I sort of disagree with what you're saying about kind of individualism and an intellectualized sort of intellectualized racism, I guess, or intellectualized desire to exclude the other races. Do you see what I'm saying?
Maybe. So are you saying that just the American racial views normally have not been fueled by an intellectual individualism, but rather just a disgust towards the outgroup?
Yeah, regarding like the Mexicans and the Indians and the blacks, like that there's sort of a base level outgroup disgust that was in fact pan-European, and that you don't really, and so you don't need.
I mean, to some extent, that was probably true in like the mid 20th century.
I think it's still true today. I think it's true today.
To some extent, it's true today.
But it's just
not something people admit.
Yeah, but I'm just saying it's heavily suppressed.
Yes. Right. Yeah, I mean, but historically, yeah, I mean, that's. I think it's been both in the United States. It's both been an actual recognition of the ways in which different groups are, different, and just simple psychological tribalism. Right. I think to the degree you can get away with it, doing it in it. I mean, I think that sort of, how should I say this? White racial consciousness looked at and justified through an individualist lens, to the degree that you can do that, is a good thing to do, because I think that's a lot less likely to lead to some of the very bad potential problems with white tribalism that can occur when it is fueled by a very strong disgust and hate-like emotions.
Right.
Now, there's the question here. We don't want to be like pie in the sky, because there's the question: to what extent can you do that? With some autists on the internet, you can do that pretty successfully, but with a lot of other people, perhaps you can't, and you just have to say, yeah, there's going to be some ugly stuff, but it's either this or nothing. So
it's either this or like black people are going to be doing it. Black people are going to be doing the exact same stuff, and then turn the country into Africa, right? It's like so. And also, like with whites, you're going to get a lot more of the intellectual types that will temper this, whereas the blacks are getting a lot. You're going to get a lot less temperance with blacks, and even with Arabs and although perhaps maybe not Indians. I don't know. We could talk about Asian groups. That's going to be a little bit different, but so yeah. And another thing, when looking at Jordan Peterson's videos, is that he does something that I find just laughable. Is he talks about racism, and he says that racism is attributing traits of the group to the individual as if the group was homogenous. So we have Jordan Peterson coming in saying that he has the definition of racism. And when I heard that, I was just like, oh my God. Like, I thought, because he talks about other stuff, and he has like all these really, he's well read. Like, he knows a lot of things. So to hear him come up and then say, well, this is the definition of racism, it was just really weird. It was really juxtaposed, him talking about all this really obscure esoteric stuff about like the postmodernists. And then he comes on and says, well, this is the definition of racism. So that was a bit jarring to hear what he said. And of course, his definition of racism is completely a result of his like totalitarian individualism, right? And it's also just retarded, like attributing traits of the group to the individual as if the group was homogenous. Okay, like nobody does that. I mean, that's just dumb. So I don't know if Jordan Peterson is being intentionally dishonest or what he's doing. And another thing I've noticed throughout his videos, he talks about these postmodernists. I don't know. I'm not in the academy, so I'm not like dealing with maybe postmodernist is a huge political movement. Is it? Do you know, Sean? Is postmodernism
is pretty behind the scenes, but it has a very large, like a lot of leftism that you see in the public uh, is the result, in part, of influence from postmodern writings that you mostly find in the university system.
Right. It sounds well. I don't know. It sounds like the skeptics, but which is sort
Well,
of just a
let me put it this
label
way
as
to
part of
hit it home in terms to race. Like, if you ever hear someone trying to deconstruct a notion of race and say that it is not real in some way because it is a social construct, that person, whether they know it or not, has been influenced significantly by postmodern stuff.
Now, the hell of it is that argument. The way, but what's funny about that is that when when a pubbie actually makes that argument, they're not making it in the same way that a postmodernist is actually making it. They're making it, oh, race is a social construct. And what the pubbie thinks when he says that is he thinks, oh, there's no genetic correlates to race, or there's no genetic clustering, or there's no that there's nothing biologically real about this category, race. That's what they're thinking. But that's actually not the point of the postmodernists. The point of the postmodernists is to say, oh, it's just a category. There's an infinite number of categories, you know.
Well, I mean, the postmodernists, their point is that A, it's a category that we constructed, and B, they want to analyze what they see as being the nebulous motives for which we constructed that category. And they think,
right.
because this idea of doing the history of scientific categories, whereby you analyze how the creation of a scientific category played into the status quo power structure.
But all that gobbledygook has nothing to do with how the actual I guess, for lack of a better term, a foot soldier who's using race as a social construct. It has nothing to do with how they're actually using it. Because a foot soldier who says race is just a social construct, they don't. Like, if you actually told them, like, okay, here's what they actually, like, the actual source of that argument, here's what they actually mean by that, they would think that that's garbage. They would just like like that's just crap. That's like,
yeah, that's probably true, because like you said, they assume that for that to be true, that must mean that it doesn't correlate with anything biologically, which is not.
Right. That's exactly what they mean by it. Right. In fact, I mean, we saw with our with the back and forth with Kraut. Like, that's when he and his little the Muppet farm was talking about the race as a social construct. They were absolutely denying the biology, right? And they used the term race as a social construct. They were denying the biology. So
yes, but then one thing you see, though, about the, like, perhaps more substantively a postmodern way of doing this is sometimes people will talk about the category of black and white being created in America in order to justify a certain kind of slavery, right? I mean, you've heard this before, the colonial times and all this sort of thing.
Right.
That is like a postmodern way of looking at the category of race, and not even, and it's an annoying way of looking at it, because, like, A, historically, like, that's wrong, but B, also, it's just like a total lack of concern for whether or not the category helps us do anything important in the world, explain things, predict reality. It's just a focus on who created it and why can we sort of be skeptical of the category based on the motives for which it was made. They do the same thing with sex, right? Like, postmodern people are heavily involved in this sort of destruction of the sexes or gender.
Sure,
and
but that I think is more of a non-starter, like, in terms of real political force. But I would say, even with that argument, where they say, oh, white and black were just invented for slavery, just like, and people say that's just retarded. Like, what, do you think black people, like, don't exist? Like, do you not have eyes? But I think when the foot soldier uses that argument, he's thinking, like, oh, there's no genetic correlates to race. These categories were just constructed based on superficial, they'll, like, the man on the street, like the foot soldier, I think, has a more coherent narrative than the source, than the postmodernist, right? But I think
certainly they have a simpler one, at the very least, like, easier to understand.
And easier to understand one that's going on in their head, but I think, but from my point of view, it's better. Now, maybe that's just because I'm a simple mind and can't grasp maybe because I just can't grasp the nuance and the articulations of the postmodernist framework. But to me, it seems like the man on the street is given these crap arguments from postmodernists, and in his mind trying to come up with something that has some connection to reality. That's what it seems like to me when he's doing that. So, and again, this is, I guess, another way in which I think perhaps the effect of the postmodernist isn't as important as it might seem, because that argument, race is just a social construct. I suspect some variation of that would exist without that language, without the, oh, it's a social construct. I suspect some variation of that argument would exist anyway, without the postmodernist, which I know very little about. So
maybe, I mean, if one thing, it's hard to disentangle the effect of postmodern academia from the impact of just leftist academia wholesale, because the overlap there is almost complete. At least it has been for the last 30 years or so.
Right. Yeah, perhaps. So, but one thing that Peterson, he talks about postmodern. Oh, go ahead. You say your bit.
I want to say the postmodern. Another thing that's maybe important about postmodernism is it popularized. How should I say this? I think it had a big impact on academics, like other academics that are outside of this, in psychology and in anthropology and these sorts of fields. And one of the things it did was it made them very conscious of the social effects of their science, because it became to be seen as naive and rubish to think of science as just a pursuit of an objective truth that you then just share with the world. Instead, you have to be very conscious about the social, like the social way in which you do the science, and then what the results will mean for society. Is this going to lead to discrimination and bad things? And in which case, you shouldn't even study this. And that's sort of very ugly, a very totalitarian impulse in science that we see now comes from, to some degree, from those people.
Well, and the thing is, it's like, it's maddening, like when you do, like when you actually like know what it's like to actually read like the peer-reviewed papers, like the actual papers themselves. It's always interesting to see, like they'll say something in the abstract, and then you look at like their data. It's like to see contradictions between like their own data, like very clear, very bald and brazen contradictions between their own data and like what they say is just like, it's just pretty amazing. Like I recall reading a paper about I believe it was about like the effects of diversity and what it was, and what it it was just amazing, because it said that diversity, that there's no real impact of diversity. However, there's a positive impact from education. But of course, just in terms of, but just the effect size was that the benefits to educational diversity, which means it's better to have dumb and smart people in an organization than it is to have all smart people in an organization. This was done in Denmark, which was it was a finding that surprised me. But I guess it makes sense, because every organization needs ditch diggers and it needs subordinates to do subordinate stuff. But the correlation with diversity was more strongly in the other direction, the positive effect of education. Now, of course, the way they did that was they justified that by saying that there were various different types of diversities, and all averaged together, this effect is not statistically significant in the context of it being a whole bunch of factors. But of course, as you can probably expect, there are certain kinds of diversity that were strongly negatively correlated with firm productivity, right? So, and those were like what we call classical race. Like they said, oh, having a Norwegian and a Dane, that's actually positive. So that's diversity. Somali, oh, that's negative. So, well, diversity is a wash, you know. So it's that kind of crap. But of course, the authors, like when they do that stuff, it's like they know what they're doing. Like unless they're, I mean, they can't be so retarded that they don't know what they're doing when they publish those fake diversity studies showing that, well, when you have a Dane and when you have a Norwegian and a Swede, oh, they work swimmingly together. It's diversity. I mean, it's just asinine. It's just dumb. So,
and I mean, go ahead.
No, you go.
I just say an example of this whole thing where there's an abstract and the paper says something else is whenever people wrongly claim that, oh, it's often the case that people from different races are more genetically similar than people of the same races. The paper that I normally go to refute that, because it is a chart that I like, is a paper Witherspoon et al. 2007. And in the abstract of that paper, it talks about how even when you analyze hundreds of genetic markers, it still happens a non-negligible amount of the time that people from different races are more similar than people of the same races. But what it doesn't say in the abstract is in that very paper, they showed that when you use thousands of markers, that probability falls near zero.
Right.
Right. And that's another example of the abstract being very misleading, because sometimes I'll link that and they'll go, you didn't even read it because they've read the abstract.
You didn't even read the abstract because the abstract says something. Yeah. And that's a problem. That's a problem with like a lot of people who, and this is something that that apparently like Reddit likes to do, is they like to look into your sources and what that means. And so whenever you have a situation where the author is like a piece of shit and the author says something in the abstract that baldly, like balls in your face, contradicts his own data, you know, like some Redditor will say, the alternative hypothesis misrepresents the sources. Here's a few links here, you know, and it's just.
Well, the worst is when it's a fucking opinion in the article, right? Like, oh, well, at the end, Putnam says that it'll all be fine in the long run. Okay, but that's not, like, we're citing the data, not fucking Putnam's dreams.
Right. So, yeah. I think maybe this should be, I don't know, I think maybe we could do a collaboration, Sean. A collaboration on I don't know, a term I like to use. I like the term regime flavor. Because I'm thinking, like, if you're reading articles, if you're reading like literature from the Soviet Union, you're reading psychology literature from the Soviet Union, like if you're doing that, any like reasonable reader is going to be able to differentiate between what's the real science, what's the real data that they're talking about, versus what is like the regime flavor. So if they say, you know, if they have all this psychological data, and then over here they say, and this data will be useful in the project of removing individualist impulses or selfish desires out of man and creating a new and moving the Soviet Union towards a post incentive psychology or something. If they say something like that, you know, that's just the regime flavor. That's just the flavor of the place and time they were in history, and you know to discard that. But it's difficult. It's like, what do you do with the regime flavor of your own place and time? That's more difficult to discard because the people who are reading the paper, they've actually been programmed that way. And so for me, like, it's obvious, like when I read Putnam, I look at the data, and then at the end, Putnam says some crap. Oh, but ultimately, somewhere over the rainbow, all the races are going to get along. It's never happened before. It doesn't happen in Latin America. It doesn't happen anywhere ever. But it could happen in the U.S. today because we just have to have enough faith. You know, when he says crap like that, you know, that's just the regime flavor of our insane place and time, and the spirit of the age, the insanity of the age is racial diversity. Right, when we know what that is, okay. But for the average Joe, like who's in that insanity, it's hard to point out that that's just that. So, sorry, end rant. Do you have something to say?
I mean, that's a good way of conceptualizing that stuff. If you read papers, it's just all over the place. So they'll have some interesting data, and then at the end, they'll throw in a really weird, awkward interpretation of it based on some leftist ideology.
Right.
And then you cite the paper, and people think that you're, because people are dumb and they think that you're citing that weird interpretation at the end and not just the data table.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's also sort of interesting. There was Louis Cavalli Sforza actually had he literally in like an updated version of he had, I forget what it was called. It was called The Races of Man or whatever, but he literally did like a global word replace of race and populations in his later editions of his work. I thought that was sort of interesting. I don't know why I thought about that. That's not directly related to the stuff about, you know, authors lying about their data, but basically, like, he did an updated version, and like a publisher convinced him use the word population, not race, and he ultimately just said, okay, so it was literally like Control F, find and replace all the terms. That was sort of interesting.
Right.
So when people say, no, race is an outdated, unscientific concept, we use the term population now. It's like, well, and so that's a good story to bring up when people, you say race doesn't exist in population. So, but yeah, but one thing that I sort of have a hard time, and I guess maybe, how do I put this? Maybe Jordan Peterson is right about this. I don't know. I don't know enough about postmodernists to know if Jordan Peterson is correct or not. But he says something. He says he talks in his speeches about how postmodernists don't care about methodology. That methodology is all just that methodology itself is a kind of category, and category is used to justify your own. It's used to it's from your own point of view, and so it's used to justify your own existence in a sense, or I'm not wording that correctly, but the creation of a methodology is from the point of view of the creator of the methodology. And so a methodology is going to be inherently biased from the perspective of that which creates it, or whatever. And so he's talking about these postmodernists as being basically against, and if you're against having a coherent methodology, then you can quite literally say they're anti-science. But again, this is something that I don't see in the field. You could say that, oh, there's massive influence of these postmodernists onto, what is called the left today. But when I'm actually out in the field dealing with like real people, they're not like that at all. They're not like saying, oh, I'm against having a coherent methodology because a coherent methodology is just Western supremacy. if they tried to do that, like if you tried to make that kind of argument, even on like a fucking sewer like Reddit, even on some like shitlib Reddit page or group or whatever, even at like the worst, or even at like just the worst Facebook groups or the worst Reddit groups, that stuff, would not fly. That stuff would not take. They did even, and so there seems to be a major disconnect between what Jordan Peterson is calling the postmodernists and what we actually see out in the wilds. And so maybe this is just my ignorance. So I thought of this as sort of like this maybe a critique of Jordan Peterson, but maybe I just don't know enough about these postmodernists. Maybe they do exist.
Well, maybe
they sound kind of like Bigfoot to me. I'll just put it that way.
It could. Well, I mean, they definitely exist. It's just a question of, do they really influence the masses? There may be a thing like this where, and I don't know, I'm just brainstorming.
Right.
It may be that postmodernist academics influence a bunch of other academics to become egalitarian, let's say, on race, and then a bunch of other leftist positions. And then people go to college and they find out their professors have these leftist beliefs. And then they take from the professors, who themselves are not the initial postmodern people unless they're in some weird like literature humanities class. But they take these sort of watered down postmodern conclusions oftentimes rather than arguments. Then they rationalize those conclusions with arguments that are way less weird than the arguments that the postmodernists actually use in their own writings.
Yeah. Well, that would mean,
is that true? I don't know. This is what I said.
Yeah. Now, the thing is, that would actually be very powerful if we could like find a way to show that like semi-conclusively that that's actually what happened, that all this race denial crap, it actually comes from like, because the thing is, when you show like an actual, like a real person, like postmodern crap, like it's just a joke. Like they just laugh. Like it's just like, what? No, shut up. You're dumb. So like basically postmodernism, in terms of like the direct application of postmodernism to the masses, is a complete non-starter. It goes nowhere. So if you can show that all this that all this race denial stuff originates from the postmodernists and has just since been kind of retconned into having like sensible sounding arguments from like, biological race deniers, that would be very effective. That's something that's like big if true, because if that could be shown, then it's like, whoa. Then I think it would be very difficult for somebody to continue to be a race denier. Because one thing I'll say is that, I mean, and another thing I've noticed is that when you get into a kind of normie shit lib Facebook groups, not like the real hardcore, like the anarchists or really massively politically active, but basically people who support Hillary Clinton, right? Those kinds of people. You talk to those people, I remember doing polls in there, and this is like a pseudoscientific polling on Facebook. I would find that they're like, the lowest I got was like in like the mid 50s in terms of how percentage wise, in terms of how many of them believed in biological races. So even like the shittiest of the shit libs tend to believe in biological race. But then they sort of believe they're all equal. Then they say, well, how likely is that? If they're biological races, what are the odds that they're going to be the same in the brain? Then you sort of get into then you're in the fun house and you're arguing, race realism with them. But I think that that if we can show that if the postmodern origins of race denial can be proven, or at least evidenced, beyond a reasonable doubt, then that could be like a really effective thing. So I don't know. Do you agree? That could be like really?
Yeah, I mean, that could be rhetorically quite effective if people realized that they were rationalizing better arguments or more seemingly more sane arguments than what the professors actually had in mind.
Dude, okay, let me look at I'm looking at the chat here. How many people here remember fucking Asrianok? Wasn't Asrianok a postmodernist? Do you remember?
He somewhat, yes.
I don't know. Do you remember Asrianok?
No one's going to remember. Yeah, I mean, I remember him, but no one is going to. That's quite far back.
I don't know. There's these people remember Ex Omniverse, and they remember.
But that's even further back than Ex Omniverse.
Oh, okay. This guy Asrianok. And then there was the Caruths. I don't know
if someone remembers. Right,
if someone remembers if someone remembers the fucking Caruths and Asrianok, those were like the two postmodernists on YouTube way back in the day. Holy shit. Yeah. Asrianok was kind of popular. The Caruths not so much. So all right.
So Peterson. At some point we should go into the Jew thing with Peterson, and that'll be a natural segue into Cofnas.
Oh, what does Peterson say about Jews? You go say something.
Oh, well, he had an article out recently about the Jewish question, where he said that the reason why Jews were overrepresented in leftist political movements is because they have higher than average IQ and score higher than average on openness to experience, a personality trait correlated with leftism. And he says that this sort of shows that conspiracy theories about Jews are wrong. And it's not a very compelling article, because suppose that's true. And he doesn't show that is true, but he's just a hypothesis he formulated. But suppose that's true, that doesn't say anything about whether or not it's a problem. Like maybe, okay, you have an explanation for why there are all these Jewish leftists. That doesn't change the fact that there are all these Jewish leftists, and that some people are going to consider that a bad thing.
Right. Yeah, I guess. That's a very basic argument that, Jews have high IQ. Haha. Yeah.
Yes, so, Peterson doesn't know anything about this sort of, he's stumbling into it fairly obviously.
Right. Whereas the Cofnas man seems to have
that's different.
He is not stumbling into it. He seems to understand sort of the more sort of group evolutionary arguments that Kevin McDonald is making, and also, I mean, another like the very simple way to sort of respond to Jordan Peterson is saying, okay, Jews have high IQs, but oh look, they're overrepresented over and above their IQ, right? And in fact, there was an article from the American Conservative that talked about that. They're called The Myth of Meritocracy. That pointed out, hey, we can use all these various measures for who is in fact the best students, and oh look, Jews are massively overrepresented even for their merit, and that whites are massively underrepresented even in terms of all these proxies for meritorious applicants and how many should be at these elite institutions. So if Jordan Peterson's argument, I haven't read Jordan Peterson's article on the Jews. If his argument is, hey, Jews are just smart, that's retarded. In terms of their overrepresentation in universities, but then again, you'd also have to get a lot of data on overrepresentation, say in news media or banking or whatever else you want to talk about. And my perception is that Jews are probably overrepresented beyond what you would predict just from like an IQ thing as well. But whatever. But anyway. So the Cofnas article, what do you think about Cofnas versus McDonald? Like, what's the 1,000 or the mile high view of that?
I think that it's good in that it's bringing sort of an intellectual, serious consideration of the Jewish questions, so-called, to the forefront. And Cofnas's paper was also just good in the sense that I thought he made good critiques of McDonald in several places.
Okay, and what was the? So I read through Kafka's paper. You read more on this. You read McDonald's first response, and then you got into.
Well, I read I read the Cofnas paper, and then I read part of the McDonald's. So Cofnas reissued McDonald's response with this weird thing where he highlighted text so that you could hover over it and see his response to the thing that McDonald said. Right. So I've read the Cofnas paper, and then I guess half of both of those things, half of the other two responses. And I mean, it's so far with it, it seems like there was some good criticism there. Do we want to like go through some of the things that it said?
Yeah, I guess one thing that sort of stuck out to me is that, well, this is what sort of seemed to stick out to me is that Kevin McDonald, like let me put it this way: there's a difference between saying, and you brought this up, and once you brought this up to me, I sort of noticed it as sort of a running motif throughout Cofnas's criticism, was that McDonald's thesis is not necessarily that Jewish intellectuals are anti-white as much as it is anti-white political movements are Jewish, right? And so what Cofnas is doing is he says, hey, Kevin McDonald doesn't mention Noam Chomsky. Kevin McDonald doesn't mention George, well, actually, George Soros would be a bad example because George Soros is kind of anti-white. But he would talk about all these Jewish intellectuals that Kevin McDonald does not mention. One thing we can think of is hey, Murray Rothbard. Murray Rothbard wasn't anti-white, quite the opposite, in fact, right? So these would appear to be counter arguments to Kevin McDonald, counter anecdotes to Kevin McDonald. But it seems to be a little bit of a straw man of Kevin McDonald, because Kevin McDonald's not saying all Jews are anti-white as much as he's saying that not all Jews, but Jews seem to spearhead anti-white political movements. That is, you look at anti-white political movements, they tend to be very Jewish, led by Jews. Even if they're not, even if Jews aren't the majority of them, they were the founding stock of them. And their existence would be, less than half if the Jews weren't there or something. So, what do you?
Yeah, I mean, one way I think maybe to think about Kevin McDonald's cultural critique is that if you're a high IQ, very smart Jewish person, there are lots of ways, lots of things you could do in life. But one avenue that is not going to be relevant to your Jewishness that you could do is to propagate intellectual ideas in order to fight anti-Semitism. And one of the ways you could do that is by undermining European nationalism. And the point isn't that all Jews choose that strategy of what to do with it, but the point is that some Jews do, and that when they choose that strategy, it is not just because they're high IQ, it is because they are doing things that they perceive to be in their ethnic interest.
Right. Yep.
Now, that is, but I mean, for one thing, though, I think it is important to say that a lot of people read McDonald's stuff and then come away with a feeling about Jews in general, right? And I think that Cofnas's paper is responding more to how McDonald's work has been interpreted and used rather than the work itself. And in my opinion, frankly, like among the people who seems to sometimes get carried away with McDonald's work and use it to form views about Jews in general is Kevin McDonald.
Right.
But and there is also some good like some of the examples that McDonald uses of Jewish people supposedly doing this sort of thing is there are instances in which that is undermined by Cofnas. Like he talks about the authoritarian. This is just an example, but the authoritarian personality is a book from the 50s in political psychology that demonized and pathologized white racial consciousness. Right. And McDonald quotes from that, and then he attributes it to the authoritarian personality, which was a book which was edited by a Jewish person. But McDonald seemingly doesn't reveal to the audience that the chapter he quoted from was written a Gentile, right? And that sort of thing seemingly isn't good.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I mean, another thing, there are several examples of that sort of thing. Some of them are very weak. Like I think McDonald is basically right about Freud, for instance, and what Cofnas says about Freud is quite weak. Because there are instances of Freud just talking about psychoanalysis being a project, the aim of which in part is to fight anti-Semitism. And then Cofnas does this thing where it's like, oh yeah, well, one time when Jews killed a bunch of Arabs, like Freud said that was bad. Okay, well, that doesn't get you very far.
Yeah.
So there's some weak points and some strong points.
Yeah. One thing that I kind of like about Cofnas's critique is that it seems to be based on, oh yeah, here's what it is. I think this is what you're talking about here. Although Freud certainly did have a Jewish identity, if only because he was continually reminded by anti-Semites, McDonald does not tell the full story. In 1929, Jews attempted to erect a partition screen to separate men and women at the Western Wall. In response, Arabs killed 29 Jews in Hebron, which led to riots in which 120 Jews and 87 Arabs were killed. A representative of the Zionists, blah, 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 asked Freud to sign a petition condemning the Arabs for initiating the violence. Freud refused to sign, explaining that the Jews were partly responsible for inviting violence upon themselves. And Freud says, I concede with sorrow that the unrealistic fanaticism of our people is in part to be blamed for the awakening of Arab distrust. This is from Freud in 2000. Wait, the link.
It's not from Freud.
Yeah, yeah, I don't think so. But the link is from 2004. So that's
that is not good evidence against what McDonald shows about the fact that the psychoanalysis just was partly an intellectual movement made to serve Jewish interests. So that doesn't mean that it's valid or invalid. It doesn't really say anything about its scientific validity, but it is an interesting historical fact about it.
Yeah. There's one. There was one. I lost it. I had it here, but then I lost the thing on that. It was anyway. So one thing that is sort of implicit throughout Cofnas's paper is race realism, and it's not like, God, I lost the passage where he talked about this. But the thing is, one piece, there's like a few pieces of evidence that Cofnas himself is actually a race realist. The first is that he cites data on Jewish IQ from Richard Lynn. And if anyone who knows who Richard Lynn is, that's like, you tend not to know who he is unless you're either a race realist or you're like hardcore anti, or a hardcore egalitarian. So, but the thing is, Cofnas is citing Richard Lynn positively. Cofnas is citing Lynn's data on Jewish IQ, as an authority. He's citing Lynn as an authority, which, okay, that's a piece of evidence that he's in fact a race realist, because who else cites Lynn as an authority but, hereditarians? And he also cites Henry Harpending and Cochrane's work on and it's the same work of Harpending and Cochrane that I cited in my video, The European Revolution, talking about basically the war on murder. And so those are two pieces of evidence. There's also a passage somewhere, if I can find it, where he talks about where he talks about, oh, here it is. I'm sorry. Okay. He says the default hypothesis is not tied, when he talks about Jewish intelligence, he says the default hypothesis is not tied to any particular explanation of the cause of above average Jewish IQ. Some researchers favor a genetic explanation. In an influential paper, Cochrane et al. Argued during the Middle Ages, this is a different paper he cited, Ashkenazim were selected for intellectual ability to succeed in white-collar occupations. However, it is theoretically possible that the Jewish-Gentile IQ gap is due in part to some yet-to-be-identified cultural factor. Whatever the case, high Jewish IQ presumably plays a role in Jewish overrepresentation in cognitively demanding activities. So when he talks about high Jewish IQ, he cites a very specific evolutionary explanation for why Jews would have higher IQs. And yet, when he's talking about the environmental thing, he cites a theoretically possible explanation that is due at least in part to some yet to be identified cultural factors. So it's a very sort of backhanded. That seems very backhanded to me. So, what do you think, Sean?
Yeah, I agree. He speaks about the stuff in a way that like hereditarian leaning people would tend to speak about it.
Right. Sort of trying to act balanced in a way that really reveals his hereditarianism on this tack. And I think that's very useful, and it's sort of questionable because in terms of what to do with this, because I think Cofnas is a hereditarian. Also, throughout his argument, there seems to be an implied genetic explanation to the higher Jewish IQ, because this is something that exists throughout all of history. And I believe Kevin McDonald talks about Jewish behavior being like this, going back into Kevin McDonald presumably talks about this Jewish behavior back in times when Jews were perhaps ghettoized, or Jews did not have, particularly good environments, So if this is something that has been going on throughout, at least since the 1500s, we'll say, that heavily implies a genetic argument. So basically a response that Cofnas' response is more sophisticated than this, but part of Cofnas' response is that while Jews genetically appear to be, more intelligent, and so this is hereditarianism. So basically the first big critique of Kevin McDonald is at least heavily implicitly has a genetic hereditarian argument in it, which I think is very good. I think is
we should probably say, in case people don't know what Cofnas' hypothesis is, which is not incredibly dissimilar from Kevin McDonald's. Because Kevin McDonald says, okay, Jewish people have a certain level of intelligence and personality that enables them to be engaged in these leftist intellectual movements, and they also are very ethnocentric, and so they're positively advocating for Jewish interests in these movements. So that's sometimes what Jewish people do. Whereas Cofnas argues that it's just that Jewish people have this personality and high intellectual ability, and he puts stress on their geography as well. That they live in very large urban environments that allows them to be put in elite positions, and that ethnocentrism only enters the picture insofar as Jewish people very obviously are not going to want to be involved in movements that are anti-Semitic, but that outside of anti-Semitic movements, you see a fairly constant level of representation of Jews across all these different, what we're talking about, scientific movements, in the hard sciences, the soft sciences, and a bunch of other domains of elite performance in the world.
Right. Yep. So,
and there's other, in terms of the whole. There are other things, like when you talk about the 1965 Immigration Act, and I guess McDonald cites a hearing in which some Jewish people were talking about, or no, it's not the 1965 Act, excuse me, it was in the 50s, and some Jewish people at a committee were talking about the equality of different ethnic groups. And I haven't gone back to the Culture of Critique to see if this is true, but Cofnas says anyway that Kevin McDonald presents this as if it's a sort of racial egalitarian ideology, when in fact the hearing was about ethnic differences between Europeans. Right, which most of the alt-right people today would sort of agree with.
Right.
And McDonald also did seemingly sometimes use statistics on Jewish intellectuals to support his viewpoint, when in fact, if you look at things like lists of the most influential intellectuals, but if you broke down those intellectuals and examined each one, what you would find is that a lot of those Jewish intellectuals that McDonald was citing were also very anti-Israel, and that this would imply that they're not all that ethnocentric. They're not just being rabidly pro-Jewish, and that they don't have this double standard. So I do think those were valid criticisms, seemingly anyway.
Yeah, one thing I think would be kind of useful would be some nice data to have, is exactly how many Jews there are that are pro-open borders and basically pro-marginalization of whites, but are pro-Israel. Because I suspect that that's actually that's a very rare thing, that the pro-Israel, pro-marginalization of white Jews are very few. But it would be nice to have some data, because the problem is, if you have because you only need a handful of them to write one article saying white nationalism, the scourge that won't go away, and then a few months later an article, why Israel's Jewish identity is of paramount importance, right? So it's a difficult thing to sort of get a handle on how often that actually happens, because I suspect it's not that often.
Yeah, I mean, and McDonald's hypothesis, as we've talked about, is formulated in such a way that as long as there are a handful of Jewish people who do this, in some sense, his hypothesis is confirmed.
Right.
In terms of the average Jewish person, this is absolutely not true. Like in the United States, they have pretty normal viewpoints on immigration. They're not rabidly leftist on immigration. In Israel, in fact, Israeli Jews are more likely than Europeans are to say that Europe should not let in a massive influx of Arabs.
Right. Also, right. So we want to... Trump's approval rating in Israel is 67%. At least it was in November.
I didn't know that. That's funny.
Yeah. So Israeli Jews are very pro-Trump. The only country that's more pro-Trump is Russia. So yeah.
What the fuck?
Yeah. Well, hey, I mean, he's a Russian agent. Of course, they're gonna love him. Anyway, so I don't know. Is there anything? I don't. Who do you think? Who won in the back and forth between Cofnas and McDonald? Who's better? Who's more?
So I think that McDonald's basic history. It seems like he maybe went too far, but there's still an important element of truth in some of the things McDonald says. However, McDonald's work has been interpreted in such a way as to inform people's feelings towards Jews in general, and Cofnas has done, I think, a good job, and other places where this has been stressed as well, at explaining why that sort of emotional response is not appropriate, because this is not an accurate depiction not only of Jews in general, but also of even just intellectually elite Jews in general. Right. So that it should not inform your sort of view of Jews wholesale.
One thing also to consider is that, I don't know, have you ever had somebody make a video response to you, or like not a video response, but somebody who brought up a video you made like 5 years ago and like wants to talk about it like after they just watched it?
Sure.
Cofnas making a response to Kevin McDonald's work that's like some of which is like 20 years old. There could be, it may take time. We may want to give Kevin McDonald some time in his response, because he responded pretty quickly to this. He responded like in less than a week in response to this article, which may not be fair to McDonald. Because the thing is, when Cofnas wrote his critique, Cofnas did it straight away. Like, Cofnas has been reading a bunch of McDonald's work, and then bam, from McDonald's point of view, Cofnas's critique came out of nowhere all at once, and it's like this big whole thing and Cofnas like knows McDonald's work very well. Like McDonald's work is still in Cofnas's random access memory in his brain, so Cofnas still has it on hand, so he can like for example, if there was a live debate between Cofnas and McDonald right now, my view is that Cofnas would destroy him, simply because Cofnas has basically. My suspicion is that right now Cofnas has a better grasp of McDonald's work than McDonald does. As strange as that may sound to a lot of people, but it's true. Like if it's if they just read it, it's fresh in their mind. Whereas to McDonald, his work is sort of 20 years in the past. It's something to keep in mind. It's something to keep in mind if Kevin McDonald's responses look weak. Consider the circumstance. Don't consider the circumstances he's laboring under. That he's having to play defense, and that's sort of the issue of playing defense versus offense. Defense is a lot tougher than offense in this kind of stuff, because when you play defense, you have to like when someone makes a video, like when Kraut was making his videos to me, like he could take his time, get a bunch of sources all in a row, and then make the video. And for me to make a response, I would have to make the response. I don't get I don't get months to make a response. If I take months to make a response, people are going to be like hounding my ass. So I have to make the response pretty quickly. This first video, I made the response literally in less than a day because it was so bad. But sometimes I only get like 2 days or 3 days, and I have to respond to something that he had sort of months to make, and I have to. And the thing is, he'll bring up like maybe an article on the alt hype, and I have to go back and reread that, get reoriented with my own work or with Sean's own work, whatever the case may be. And so it's more difficult to defense is more difficult than offense for those reasons. So that's just something to keep in mind looking at Kevin McDonald's responses. So I don't know. Anything else you wanted to say?
That's true. Well, one thing interesting, maybe that Cofnas brought up is that you can find an overrepresentation of Jewish people also among hereditarian intellectuals. If you just look at people talking about genetic differences and even group genetic differences between people, like Arthur Jensen was part Jewish. Richard Herrnstein obviously was Jewish. What's his name? Roth. So I can't remember the name of the fellow who wrote The Perils of Diversity. Is Byron Roth? I think that's his name. Is obviously.
Oh, who was that lady who wrote?
And Steven Pinker is Jewish.
Steven Pinker, but there's also that lady who wrote the academic consensus on like intelligence.
Linda Gottfredson.
Yeah, Gottfredson. Is she Jewish? That sounds Jewish. Gottfredson.
I think so, but I'm not sure.
Well, that sounds like a Jewish name, and her face looks Jewish.
Yeah, she looks Jewish. That's what I was thinking as well.
So, but I don't know if she is or not. But anyway, lots
and
of views among the hereditarians. So,
yeah, and you can do. You can even do a similar thing if you look at sort of important conservatives today that are pro, like stopping, anti-immigration. Basically, you can talk about people like Michael Savage. You can talk about people like Matt Drudge. You can talk about Ben Shapiro, who did not like Trump, but is pretty decent on a lot of border questions and things like that.
Yeah, I'll say Ben Shapiro was going around with Ann Coulter talking about closing the borders before Trump sort of emerged as a figure. So, Ben Shapiro was actually doing some good work before Trump showed up. And as soon as Trump showed up.
You can look at Miller, right, who wrote a lot of Trump's anti-immigration stuff, is like literally written by a Jewish guy.
Yeah. But now Miller's secretly steering Trump towards being
so, and this isn't a point against McDonald because, again, he's just talking about one thing that Jews do. He's not saying it's what all Jews do. But the point is just you can look at even a lot of seemingly right-wing-ish things, as long as they're not explicitly anti-Semitic. If you look, you can find quite a lot of Jews.
Right. Yeah, and this is one thing I've sort of pointed out. I mean, it's probably the case. Like just looking at how Jews voted in the 2016 election, the 2012, like in all the elections, they tend to vote Democrat. Based on that, Jews are almost certainly going to be overrepresented in what we call leftist politics. So no doubt about that. But one thing I sort of look at on that is, how do I put this? And this is something that I've been saying, talking to Mike about, is that if you have a bunch of people who hate the banks, who hate the fire sector, who hate, Hollywood, who hate the press, who hate the political party bosses, they think the political party bosses are all shit. It's like, what more do you want? It's like all these things that are ostensibly, I haven't looked at the data on all this very deeply, but ostensibly all these things that a lot of people hate so much are inordinately Jewish. If that's the case, then what's like, they already hate them. Like what's the point? And one thing I'm thinking of is that in the past, you had a lot of these things, and these are sort of timeless. People tend to hate party bosses. They tend to hate the bankers. They tend to hate media. They tend to hating the lion press is something that people have done all throughout history, right? Hating degenerate art that promotes, values alien to non-artists. That's something that's, kind of a universal thing. So, and so what I think has happened in the past is that one thing in the past you could say, look at all these things, look at how bad they are. Oh, on top of that, the people who are doing this stuff, Jews. And you, as like a real hardcore, this is 1930s Germany, or this is 1900s Russia. You, as what we would call today a fundamentalist, orthodox, a fundy, right? Is basically everyone back then was what we would today call a fundy. You really don't like Jews. So calling them on top of all that criticism, pointing out that it's Jewish may have been an advantage back then, right? But today, and so that may have been why, and so that may have been why they did that, to say, look at all these bad things. Oh, it's also Jews. That's just another level of the call to action to smash these institutions that these people hate, that are perennially hated throughout history. And today, though, it doesn't make there's no advantage to pointing out that they're disproportionately Jewish like there was in the past. So I think it may be sort of cart before the horse, or whale tagging the dog, or whatever analogy you want to use. So, but that's just sort of a thought I had about the parallels of anti-Semitism throughout history.
The only time that I think it makes sense to bring it up is when them. Sorry, there's a lot of noise. Them being Jewish explains some.
Is it coming from me? Is it coming from me?
No, it's coming from me. The world around me. But anyway, the only time outside, I should specify. But anyway, the only time it would make sense to really bring it up is in cases when they're doing some behavior that is explained by sort of ethnocentric motives as Jewish people, right? So, for instance, if we're talking about Richard Lewontin, I think is a very good example of this, and why he makes this argument that is bizarre, that is totally out of the norms of science, the more variation within the between, for anyone who for some reason doesn't know. The part of it, so you say, oh, why did he do that? Well, he was very concerned with fighting racism, the belief in racism. It's like, okay, why was he so concerned? Well, the story becomes, I think, even more understandable. We say, oh, well, he was a Jewish person, and this was sort of in the wake of the Nazi stuff.
Right.
And the thing is, so in my experience, talking to normies about this, saying that sort of thing actually makes it more compelling, and they're fine with it. But there's sort of a problem here, which is that I think basically people who feel actually have a dislike of Jewish people, just talking about the raw emotion here, who are anti-Semitic in that sense, should never do this, because they cannot talk about Jewish people in a way that doesn't sound anti-Semitic. It seems to be incredibly difficult for such people. By contrast, if you look, sorry, what?
Oh, there's a comment here saying the masses need an ideology that pulls in the right direction. How can the average person be? This principle doesn't work. I believe this Nordbra, I believe he's referring to not naming the Jew in this instance. This is not that theoretical, because right now these institutions I talk about are already hated, right? I mean, Trump will go around talking about the lion press today, and it's already there. So you don't. This isn't a theoretical thing. Like people already hate, Hollywood. They already hate the degenerate media. They don't use the term degenerate. That's a term we use, but that's basically what. This is already this is already a popular thing. So it's not a theoretical thing. So anyway, continue.
If you bring up them being Jewish in a way that doesn't sound offensive, and you just say, look, they're part of an ethnic group that nationalist sentiments led to a huge number of them dying. And so the generation after that, the people who were scientists, were very concerned about this sort of thing, and that played into their motivations. That would be true of anyone. If your ethnic group had millions, however many million, we don't need to get into that, but had a lot of people die, let's say, you might suffer from similar motivations. You can see how that could happen. We can empathize with this. If you can present it in that sort of way, then in my experience anyway, this is anecdotal, but I've talked to plenty of random sort of normie people about this. It's fine, but people that viscerally feel anti-Semitic seem unable to say it in that way, and instead just talk about how the essence of Jewishness is to subvert European culture. They start talking about it in ways that are just not very good rhetorically.
Yeah, and of course, I think if you're being sued in a frivolous lawsuit by a bunch of the worst shit-lived Jews from Jew lawyers from New York, you may have a hard time being tempered in your discussion about Jews. Anyway, so okay, Black Acid Lizard. Oh, this is a guy from way back. It's very difficult to understand the actions and motivations of Jews without coming to dislike them viscerally. Perhaps, but the thing is,
I mean, I think that in general,
coming to that point's a very long road. And when you're talking to somebody, you're talking to someone at the very start of that road. And so they haven't been down the road. So, you know, you have to talk to people in a way that they'll understand. And if they don't, you know, according to your conception, Black Acid Lizard, if they don't quote unquote understand the Jew, then talking about the Jew is not going to be helpful. And from a practical politics standpoint, you know, maybe if you got everybody to understand the Jews as you do, Black Acid Lizard, it would be beneficial. Maybe, I don't know, but let's just sort of stipulate that for argument. That's something that I don't think is very realistic, and I think from a practical standpoint going forward, where we are now, it's much more effective to just leave the Jew stuff alone. Just say, because the thing is, you know, it's perfectly, like, for lack of a better term, legal to talk about how terrible white shit libs are. Like, you can say that forever. You can talk about shit libs forever, and that's like, I guess, you know, that's Queensberry rules. That's like, you know, people won't think that that's like below the belt or not something you're allowed to do. Right? But as soon as you start talking about Jews, then you've entered a sort of demonic space. And yes, ultimately, like, we want to have a more free sort of mental space where, you know, there are no such demonic spaces or things you can't talk about. But, you know, it's sort of like, you know, ultimately, sure. And ultimately, I think it would be a good idea to sort of rehabilitate Hitler and have a more realistic view of what Hitler and the Nazi regime was. The thing is, in terms of priorities, that's pretty low. You know, like right now, we're about to be devoured by, you know, we're you know, the wolf is in the gates, and these are sort of things that are kind of tangential and not very important in my mind. So
I'd like to also say that I think Black Acid is totally right to say that it's very hard to look at that Jewish stuff and not come away angry about it. And the reason why I say that is just because I look at most people who have ever looked into this Jewish stuff come away very angry about it, right? The vast majority of people. So I think, now I genuinely do not, I don't know what to say, like, I do not have any visceral sort of dislike of Jewish people. And there are ethnic groups who, you know, this is not like some weird egalitarian person saying this. There are ethnic groups, so I do have a visceral negative reaction towards the Jewish people, just aren't one of them. And so, but I think, as I said before, if you do have a visceral dislike of Jewish people, it's very hard to talk about them in a way that is rhetorically effective. And so, but that is exactly why I have a degree of Ryan's that basically the vast majority of people, and I don't really talk about it much, and I never talk about it on like YouTube or anything like that. It's generally best not talked about. I mean, like, either there are reasons to be mad at this person and to dislike the person, and they're Jewish, right? In which case you can just talk about the reasons to dislike them, or there are not reasons to dislike the person and they're Jewish. In which case you should not be trying to get people to dislike them. That's sort of what I think it normally comes down to.
Yeah, and the thing is that, like, of course, it's also like people also get sort of peeved when you talk about, say, Hispanics or Arabs or Africans. But the thing about those groups is those groups are, they're visibly distinct, and it's so kind of in your face what they are. Whereas Jews, like, they look white, right? So it's something that's kind of hard. It's hard to understand if you're not looking for it. So
especially, I will say, if you're not from New York. Because a lot of the people in the alt-right who really get into this stuff are from the northeast part of the country, where there are lots of Jews, and in most of the country there are almost no Jews. And that's an important regional difference.
Right. So, and when you're talking about more visibly genetically distinct different races, like, that's something that's easier to talk about because, like, it's obvious. Frankly, it's because it's obviously true. So it's a much easier case to make, and what you're dealing with is a much clearer tension between something that like white people just kind of know versus what they want to believe. Whereas with Jews, they don't know, because Jews are not a visibly distinct group. Now, if all Jews had, like, you know, I mean, there is sort of like a collection of phenotypic traits that correlate with being Jewish, but it's not pronounced enough to say, oh, that's clearly a Jew. Like if all Jews look like literal trolls, then yeah, people could, then you could probably talk about Jews, and people would make the pattern identifying aspect of the brain would be able to see that much more clearly, and you could talk about Jews in the way you can talk about blacks, but frankly, it's because Jews look like white people. It makes it a lot harder. It makes it so you probably just can't talk about them. Right? You're just better off not mentioning them. You're just saying like we're against all white shit libs. White shit libs up against the wall. If they happen to be Jewish, so be it. That seems to be just a much more effective way to talk about that. So, yeah. So, all right. So yeah, we talked about the Cofnas. We talked about the Peterson. Do you have anything more to say about the Cofnas?
Don't think so.
Don't think so. Oh yeah, we wanted to talk about the Sandre. So I don't think Sandre. Well, I don't think Sandre is worth a freaking video response. Like, I mean, unless you do, it's your channel, whatever you do. But from my opinion, I don't think Sandre is worth like responding to. But but you can respond to him here. He gets like a bit of a stream, is what he gets. So.
Well, look, we talked about that. Yesterday I was talking to Ryan, and I said, "Oh, Sandre made this video. I'll watch it. Maybe say something about it on the stream." But it's awkward to even talk about because of how fucking stupid it is. It is like he would read sentences in the article and then like seemingly just not understand the sentences. And this is an article about lead and IQ. And like for instance, he made this big thing about he talked about, oh, I referenced the study, and what the study found was that current lead levels predicted IQ when you controlled for prenatal lead exposure. But if you control for current lead levels, prenatal lead exposure does not predict IQ. So I said, okay, that is some evidence for the view that current levels of lead impact IQ, but that lead doesn't have super long-lasting effects, at least within the range of variation in lead exposure that study looked at. Right. So I think if I say that, then everyone, like Ryan, you understand what that means, right?
Yeah, that's right.
It seems pretty clear. He just didn't get it. He just read it and then said, what do you mean? This shows that prenatal levels do correlate with IQ, and who cares about like the control thing, whatever. Prenatal blood lead levels does impact IQ. He just literally did. It was like the whole fucking video was like this. He just didn't understand. I don't know if it's because English is a second fucking language or because he's half retarded. I don't know. But it was an awkward video to watch because of how dumb it was. Yeah. And I initially was going to do a response, but how do you do a response to that? How do you do a response to him just not speaking English?
Right. Well, I don't know. I'm sort of thinking like, let's say somebody says, hey, like hitting yourself on the head with a hammer, that could cause you to have less intelligence. And they say, yes, but I don't think racial variation in being hit on the head with a hammer repeatedly explains much of anything. It's like, what do you mean? like being hit on the head with a hammer could have an effect. I think this is the I have to apologize. I was actually looking up trying to find your article on the race, lead, and IQ, because I'm going to add that and Sandre's video in the description, so I wasn't listening to you very closely. But I believe he was making the David Sherratt fallacy, right? Which is basically like, oh, here's a potential issue.
Well, no, it was a potential issue that was addressed in the study, and he just like did not understand the idea of the controls.
Right. Or saying like here, okay. But was it just like
another thing he does, he talks about, so I say in the article that there was this study that looked at blood levels and how that predicted IQ after you controlled for maternal IQ and education. And I said, oh, this is good. This takes care of some genetic confounding. And he just doesn't get it. He's like, what? What does maternal IQ and education have to do with genetics? There's no control for genes here. I was like, okay, you're just dumb. Like, and he's been involved in these debates now for months. So I'm sure someone has said to him at some point in all of these debates he's been in,
well, the thing is, like, he could say maternal IQ doesn't matter because IQ is 100% environmental. so there's nothing genetic there, right?
Right. If he thinks maternal IQ and education was 100% environmental, but that's insane, and no one thinks that.
Right. Well, see, that's sort of the issue. It's like, well, like you're just wrong. But the thing is, they could just sort of deny, like they could just deny like all the way down, like turtles all the way down. They could just say, oh, that's environmental. Everything's environmental. What about the studies that say they're oh, no. It's like, but the control
just no.
just no, or they forget. They'll just have amnesia and forget that this was proven to be like.
Or also, I mean, another example of apparently this article just surpassing its cognitive limits was I talked about the fact that a given shift, say a shift of 1 microgram per deciliter of blood of lead, is going to have a bigger effect the lower the base level of lead is. So that if you're going from 0 to 1, that's going to have a bigger effect than going from 15 to 16. Right?
Okay. Right.
That's not that complicated. He just did not understand what that meant. Like, he read it and did not get it and said, "What do you mean? This doesn't make sense. Lead has an effect on IQ. Why are you lying?"
Well,
I don't know what the fuck. Like, yeah, I don't know what to say. It's like, this is why it's awkward, because it's so dumb.
Do you have a link to his?
You just feel like you have to repeat.
Do you have a link to his video? No, because give me a link to his video,
yes,
and I'm gonna hook tube it. So.
All right, I'll send it to you on Skype here.
All right, so I'll put that in the description.
But yeah, so I mean, there's nothing real good to talk about in the video. There's not like nothing interesting, particularly, because it was just really done. Apparently, he had another one of these experts, like some neuroscience guy behind the scenes. Well, actually, I think he linked to his Twitter. But these people, I don't know. But this is like the same with the crowd stuff. These experts suck. They're not experts in the right things. There's no way that this person is actually an expert and watched all of this. Actually, maybe he is, because neuroscience people notoriously fail at the fucking freshman statistics stuff. So maybe he doesn't understand regression.
Jesus
either.
Christ! This video is like 24 minutes long. God damn it! All right. It's a long ass video.
It's a long video. Yeah,
it's a long video, but it's amazing. Like watching a Kraut video. It's like Kraut made videos to me that are like 40 minutes long, and it's like, you gotta find the genes, like, for 40 minutes. It's like a magic act. Like, how do you do that? How do you say, find the genes for 40 fucking minutes?
There was a bit of the find the genes stuff in this as well, because one of the things he got mad at was that I didn't talk about the neurobiological mechanism by which lead impacts IQ. I just talked about the study showing that it does. Because no one, like, this isn't a freaking just comprehensive introduction to the relation between lead and the brain. But you fuck. This is addressing a specific argument.
I don't know. Because you imagine like, oh, you think bleach causes health problems? Can you tell me the neurochemical mechanism by which drinking bleach?
Imagine if you had that guy bleach and he fucking died. So no, you explain how it happened, or I'm drinking the bleach.
But yeah, this is just like we call Star Trek science. Like, people who don't like actually read the papers think like, I don't know. They think science is like, finding, microscopic explanations for everything. That's science. They don't think of it in terms of like, hypothesis and like what predicts. They don't think in terms of like a predictive model based on like, based on collecting data and based on hypotheses and doing stuff. They think of it like Star Trek. Is it Star Trek? The closer it is to Star Trek, the closer then it's science. So that's just something I've noticed. And I've said that a bunch of times. So whatever. Updated the description to have Sean's article and Sandre's video to Sean. I'll put in the Cofnas thing. And do you have McDonald's response to Cofnas?
No, I downloaded it as a PDF, so I don't have a link.
Okay. Well, should I link to Cofnas' article, but not McDonald's response?
I mean, people can find it if they look. It's not hard to find.
I don't know.
Of course, we can find it if we looked, but
yeah, we could find it if we look too. But also, this stream's been going on for 2 hours and 50 minutes. I think it's time to sort of wrap it up. So, So, all right. So I think we're ready to wrap it up, Sean. Are we ready to go? A long
All right,
video.
we're ready.
Kettle,
Let's
Ryan.
go.
No, but my videos are good. My videos are good, asshole. Yamamoy-chan. Okay. All right. So that'll be it. Show's over.